I'm Derek Chollet at GMF, and I'd like to welcome you to today's book talk with Mira Rapp-Hooper to talk about her book, Shields of the Republic, The Triumph and Peril of America's Alliances, trying to get a nice shot of it here for the camera. It's a great pleasure to welcome Mira here to join us at GMF. I wish we were doing it in person, but I'm glad we're able to do this virtually to talk about what is a terrific new book. It's very timely to have this deep dive into the history, the logic, and the challenges ahead for America's alliances. And so Mira's really performed a great service in the writing of this book. And given the news just today, I can think of no better time to have this discussion. So Mira, great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Derek, thanks so much for having me and to your team for organizing this great event. I'm also grateful to the audience for joining us at this unusual moment.
Absolutely. We're gonna have a great discussion. Mira and I are gonna talk amongst ourselves for 20 minutes, 30 minutes or so. And then I wanna open it up to the audience, to all of you to ask questions. And please, if you have a question, use the Q&A function here in Zoom, and you'll get in the queue, and we'll get to your question in a little bit. But Mira, to start things off, I'd like to ask you about the title of the book. I know that an author can labor quite some time to get that right title, and I was really inspired by your title. You play off a book that's, gosh, over 70 years old now, or nearly 70 years old. And I'd like to talk about where you got Shields of the Republic, and what did you mean by that?
It's a great first question, Derek, and it sort of shows the fact that you are such a deep and thoughtful author, of course, of your own books, because authors do really labor over these things. For me, Shields of the Republic is an appropriation of a subtitle of a book written by Walter Lippmann, the mid-century journalist and commentator. Lippmann wrote a book in 1943 at the height of World War II called U.S. Foreign Policy, Shield of the Republic. And I really wanted to allude to Lippmann's work here because for me, it said quite a lot about why the American alliance system has been so good for the United States and why it remains so important going forward. And there are a couple of elements of Lippmann's work that transmitted those messages to me. The first is the idea that Lippmann argued in 1943 that the purpose of foreign policy is, of course, to protect the Republic, to allow it to progress and thrive, as the United States foreign policy has done for many decades, none so more than its alliance system in that endeavor. And the fact that it will need that even more so today as geopolitical power shifts and 21st century threats feel ever more uncertain. But another really important part of Lippmann's argument is that foreign policy has to be solvent. He talks a lot about strategic solvency, which means that the means that we use for our foreign policy have to match the ends or the objectives. And American foreign policy always has to be fit to its objectives if it is to be sustainable. To my mind, one of the best things about America's alliance system from Washington's perspective is the fact that it has allowed the United States to maintain a very ambitious foreign policy for many decades and do so in a cost-effective way. So I simply added an S to Lippmann's Shield of the Republic to pluralize it and emphasize the fact that the United States has had many different approaches to alliances over the course of the Republic's history, and it's going to need to take a new approach if it is to save this system for the road ahead.
Well, I want to pick up on your last point, because, as I said, your book is a great work of history. It's a great work of analysis, and it's very much of this moment. So when you tell us a little bit about why you set out to write this book and what need were you trying to meet here?
I think, Derek, I realized this book needed to be written in 2016 when, of course, the Republican nominee for president at the time, Donald Trump, was on the campaign trail repeatedly attacking America's alliances as expensive and useless. And like so many other foreign policy professionals, I had sort of a visceral reaction to this. But the part of it that actually worried me the most was the fact that these broadsides were not completely unreasonable. That is, for generations of Americans who had known relative peace and relative prosperity, it probably wasn't clear why Washington had several dozen alliance commitments flung about Europe and Asia, much less what those had actually done for the United States. And as a longtime student of alliances, I knew that that was actually a feature of this system's triumph more than it was some kind of flaw. That is, when alliances are working, we actually don't see anything happening. Alliance success is measured by the wars and crises that don't ever occur. So the system had actually buried its own record. And it struck me that in the years to come, if we didn't unearth that record, it was going to be even harder for policymakers and the public to defend what has ultimately been a hugely useful strategy for the United States. So I set about to unearth that record after 2016. That said, the arguments I'm taking on in the book are really much bigger than any one president, and the forces that are afflicting America's alliances will be with us long after he leaves office.
So I definitely want to get into what you argue is the most misunderstood thing about alliances. But before I get to that, I want to retrace our steps and how we got here. And you talk about this in the early part of the book, but I think it's important to get on the table. The journey our country has traveled in its own thinking about alliances. And for the better part of the first 150 years of America's existence, it actually tried to do the opposite of what we've been doing over the last 70 years, which is it tried to stay out of entanglements. So talk a little bit about that journey and why we went from this long history of trying to stay out of this stuff to then building what is arguably the most successful and robust alliance system ever.
Absolutely. The quick explanation for this sea change in strategy is the requirements of self-defense. That is what the United States saw as the requirements of its self-defense. Between the Revolutionary War and the Second World War, the United States took pains not to form standing alliances with any country. After ending the Franco-American alliance, which had allowed the United States to prevail in the Revolutionary War, it certainly would not have without France. Presidents in particular made it their business not to form any more alliances, in part because George Washington had admonished against standing alliances in his farewell address. Now, Washington's admonishments had actually been quite contextual, and they were really about the Franco-American alliance. But out of fealty to this charge, presidents well into the 20th century were skittish about suggesting the United States ally with any country. So much so that Woodrow Wilson, as he navigated the United States into the First World War, created a whole new term so that the United States could join European allies in the conflict without officially allying with them. But the Second World War really changed all of that. And after World War II, the United States concomitantly changed tacks. The war demonstrated for the first time that the United States was no longer secure by dint of its favorable geography. That is, its two ocean barriers and its relatively friendly neighbors would not be enough to keep it safe, primarily because of developments in military technology like long-range power projection capabilities and, of course, nuclear weapons. So it turned to a novel approach. Whereas many countries had used alliances for centuries to fight and win specific wars, the idea here was that Washington would use alliances to keep them from starting at all. The aim was to hold the balance of power in both Europe and Asia using alliances for a sort of three-part interlocking strategy. Alliances would allow it to use forward defense, that is, the forward positioning of bases and troops to meet threats overseas. They would allow it to establish deterrence on behalf of allies, that is, to dissuade adversaries from attacking at all. And they would also allow it to use allied assurance, that is, efforts to bring allies on sides with US foreign policy. It was an incredibly ambitious gamble. It was done primarily for self-defense, and it paid off better than its architects really could have imagined at the time.
Mm-hmm. And you point out in this book, in the evolution of these alliances, we look at Asia and Europe, the two principal strategic arenas in which our alliance system was formed. They form very, very differently. And I mean, it's obvious. In one place we have NATO, and another it's a set of bilateral agreements, although there have been efforts over the years, as you point out, to create more multilateral security structures in Asia. Maybe talk a little bit about the different evolution trajectories of those two alliance systems, and how they operate differently, and perhaps if there's pros and cons that you would argue of the two. And then finally, as an addendum to the question is, think of the third major strategic arena for the United States, the Middle East, where we do not have treaty allies or formal alliances, but we have what are very deep military relationships with many countries there, and how that then is different from an alliance system, and is that perhaps better or worse?
Absolutely. So it's a big question. I'll try to break it into chunks here. Thanks, Derek. The first piece is why we had two very different structured alliance systems evolve in Europe and Asia, respectively. And the answer is that the European alliance, the transatlantic alliance, was really born of a demand signal from our European partners. That is to say, as the Cold War began to set in Europe, a group of European partners came to the Truman administration and asked the administration to associate itself with a defense pact that they themselves were forming in Europe, a multilateral arrangement that foresaw potential conflict with the Soviet Union, or what would later become the Warsaw Pact. This was known as the Brussels Pact. And while the United States declined to join that specific treaty, that idea really planted the seed in the Truman administration's head that there could be great value in a transatlantic alliance. And the way to do it would be to create a guarantee that would look a lot like what European countries were already doing on their own, albeit to provide a promise of American air power and political backing to their efforts. And so that, of course, would become the Atlantic Alliance. In Asia, the process was much more piecemeal. It occurred in two different waves, and each of those waves was a reaction to a form of conflict that occurred in the region. The first wave of alliances in Asia took place right after the beginning of the Korean War, and around the time when World War II in Asia was officially concluded. That is when the peace treaty was signed with Japan. There was a first set of pacts that included Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and the Philippines that all occurred in that moment. The second wave occurred after the French collapse at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, after it seemed like communism might really be on the march. And then there was another energy behind American alliance formation in Asia. But part of the reason why this system was never a multilateral grouping was because for most of the Cold War, our allies in Asia didn't necessarily share rivals. Some were primarily concerned with the Soviet Union, others with the People's Republic of China, Korea, of course, with North Korea principally. So rather than really trying to focus on a multilateral structure that would consider itself to have one contiguous set of front lines, the bilateral system of so-called hub and spokes alliances won the day. An additional reason for this, frankly, was the fact that immediately after the war, Japan still rattled the nerves of a lot of countries in the region. So it did not yet seem time to bring it into an alliance with other American partners in Asia. Of course, this is a very different set of structures in both Europe and Asia than what we see in the Middle East, as you've alluded to, Derek. And I tend to see the central distinction as one of being formal versus informal alliances in the first place. That is, that in Europe and Asia, we have mutual defense treaties with an identified set of partners. And while it's not necessarily prescribed what exactly our actions will be if any one of them becomes a victim of an unprovoked attack, we've made it very clear that we would see that situation as being a direct threat to our security interest. And while the United States has a lot of other forms of defense commitment around the world, nothing else quite rises to that level of sanctity and importance as these mutual defense treaties. But part of the lack of mutual defense treaty can also mean that there can be a little bit of a lack of clarity. That is, with the mutual defense treaty, the United States and its allies have standing channels through which they engage in various forms of defense cooperation. They have a reasonably shared sense of what their expectations of one another are. And I think that helps to explain why actually America's alliance record is so strong, not only in defending our allies, but in managing negative consequences of alliances like adventurism or entanglement. Without those formal structures in the Middle East, I think those lines are a little bit less clear, and that can lead to some of the deeply complicated relations and events that, of course, have unfolded in those partnerships over the course of the decades.
Well, just to drill down on this point just a little further, over the years, there's been talk of creating an Asian NATO. Just in the last few years, there's been talk of a Middle East NATO. I'm just curious, given the depth of thinking you've done on alliance structures in Asia and Europe and our relationships in the Middle East. How feasible do you think that is? Is it wise, or is that just kind of loose talk and a fundamental misunderstanding of what our alliances are all about?
I think it represents a high aspiration amongst allies. That is to say, we hold NATO up as the gold standard because it has been so successful, and because its unified command and its unified structure seems like the sort of paradigmatic way to do an alliance. But I tend to think it probably still is not realistic in Asia, and certainly is not realistic in the Middle East. And that doesn't necessarily jeopardize those systems or mean that they're weaker, just that that's not the most appropriate structure for the task at hand. One example actually of this high aspiration, of course, occurred in history, and that is the fact that the United States, once upon a time, had an alliance in Southeast Asia called SEATO, which was supposed to be NATO for Southeast Asia. The problem ultimately with SEATO was that it wasn't fit to the task at hand. It was an attempt by the United States and a sort of diverse, eclectic group of treaty partners to create a security guarantee against communist subversion in Southeast Asia. But promises of the potential use of American nuclear weapons or high-end military defense really didn't match that task. And therefore, the integrated military structure never got off the ground. And much as partners seemed to want it, it didn't even make a first step in the direction of becoming NATO. Now, I think that American treaty allies in Asia are far more capable and far more focused today than SEATO ever was. But the fact remains that there are a lot of differences in threat perceptions. We still have some allies who are principally focused on North Korea, namely South Korea, whereas others are increasingly focused on China. Of course, there I would include Japan, also the Philippines, and Australia. But they still see China in different ways. And the parts of China's role in the region that they react to and they perceive as threatening aren't necessarily the same. Some of them have maritime disputes, for example. Others are more worried about high-end military threats. So to my mind, the hub and spoke system can continue to work for us so long as where there are shared threat perceptions and the possibility of the exploitation of more cooperation, we make it our business to draw those out. That is, we do a bit of networking amongst America's alliances in Asia so that allies can increasingly cooperate on areas like the South China Sea or responding to Belt and Road. But we don't have to build a NATO inside of Asia to do that.
Great. I want to get into your ideas further on reinventing alliances that the latter half of your book's about. Before I get to that, I'd like to press you on one thing again that I think your book helps answer, which is a puzzle of why have America's alliances proven so successful? I mean, you make the point that one of the reasons why it's easy to dismiss the importance of alliances is because they've worked so well, you tend to take them for granted. And when you compare our alliances and the durability and the strength of those alliances compared to other countries in the past, the Soviet Union, for example, or today, a country like China, what you talk about an alliance logic, America's alliance logic. So explain America's alliance logic and how that answers part of the question of why our alliances have proven so successful over time.
Well, it's a great question, Derek. And part of the answer is that the logic has never been entirely fixed. That is, that America's alliances have always been works in progress since we made the decision to form this ambitious system. And that it was experimental at first. And as we built it out, we understood that no size would fit all. And we would continue to kind of keep building this airplane mid-flight. And that's part of the reason why it's lasted so long. As I alluded to in one of our earlier exchanges, the United States has always had a few different streams of motivations that go into its alliances, and this was certainly true throughout the Cold War. That is, some alliances were high priority for forward basing and forward deployment efforts. Some alliances were places where the United States was really more focused on assuring the ally and sort of bringing it along with American policy. But different logics, be it for forward defense, for deterrence, for assurance, could occur differently in each pact, and there need not have been one size fits all approach. We also saw lessons sort of time and again throughout the Cold War that policymakers were constantly scrambling to rebuild these things in action. That is, NATO started out as an American treaty pledge with the potential promise of American air power on the European behalf should it become necessary. But there was no built out NATO military structure at first. That was, in fact, a reaction to North Korea's invasion of the South, as well as Soviet Union nuclear weapons developments that convinced the United States and its partners that they actually did need to unify their defense efforts. And renovation projects like this went on throughout the Cold War. When the Soviet Union achieved nuclear weapons parity, there was a whole new round of crisis in NATO that seemed like it could rend the alliance. But ultimately, the alliance worked together to build the new structures that were necessary to take it into the next era. So what I see as the sort of recipe for success here is that we've kind of actually always understood that defensive alliances amongst sovereign states are messy businesses, that there is no perfect answer and no rule book that holds fast over time, but rather that alliances need to be rebuilt and revisited as geopolitics change. And we've done that incredibly well for 70 years. The question is whether we're going to do it equally well going forward.
Well, perhaps the most notable and controversial event of alliance adaptation has been NATO enlargement. I think in the last 25 years, there's probably been no single issue that's been as enduringly controversial, certainly within the academic community, than the wisdom of, or lack thereof, of NATO enlargement. And so because NATO is seen as sort of the shining example of what one can achieve with an alliance, I'd like you to talk a little bit about that journey that NATO has traveled, why you think it's proven so controversial, and how that is, if you believe it is, a good example of adaptation and being fit for purpose.
Absolutely. So, I think the reason that NATO enlargement were so controversial, of course, is that it sort of defied logics of international relations, right? And this controversy was born of a huge strategic success, which is the fact that the alliance outlasted the adversary it was designed to deter and defend against, leaving open questions about what its future should be. But academics in particular, and some other folks with a more realist orientation, argued that with its adversary demise, the alliance should meet the same fate. Its purpose was over. Policymakers, of course, chose to have it continue on and to repurpose it for the world that they faced in the 1990s. And I think that generally this was a very wise decision. Having seen a tool work so well, I think it was not at all the wrong thing to do, to think about how it could be modernized for the world that they faced then in the post-Cold War era. But of course, with no central adversary present in Europe, NATO enlargement was not conducted primarily with Russia as a defense threat in mind. That is, there were a lot of compelling logics to it, including the consolidation of democracy, prevention of resurgent nationalism, but the focus on defensibility against Moscow really wasn't central to the picture. And that built into the alliance, of course, some vulnerabilities that Moscow has subsequently exploited, namely the fact that the alliance landed on Russia's doorstep, making it very hard for NATO to defend the eastern flank of the alliance now that we do have a resurgent Russia on our hands. But I don't think that this, by any stretch of the imagination, dooms these efforts. Quite to the contrary, I think in the recent years, we've seen the alliance increasingly rise to those efforts, especially after Russia's actions in Crimea and Ukraine. And we increasingly see charges outside of the military domain that will ensure that NATO has a lot of purpose for times to come. There, of course, I'm thinking about things like Russia's election interference in the United States and Europe, which are non-military strategies that aim to advance Moscow's aims without ever triggering alliances at all, as well as the fact that the alliance has only recently recognized China as a challenge for the transatlantic alliance as well. So I think there is no question that if NATO can keep up this reinvention project, it has a huge set of charges for it for many years to come, but they are not small. They will require significant resources. And of course, they will require a fair amount of unity, and all of that is in short supply in this moment.
Well, Mira, I wanted to follow up with you on that, on this last point about your argument that we need to broaden our alliances in the sense of the beyond just kind of simple military terms. And I'd like you to expand on that further, talking about NATO, and maybe if you have any specific ideas on NATO and China in particular, or also on election interference. NATO for years has been trying to talk through, for example, how to handle cyber issues. Before we even thought about disinformation or election interference, it was just cybersecurity. Of course, it's much broader than that. But then also transfer that over to Asia and how you think we should be reimagining a broader set of alliance tasks in Asia.
Absolutely. So, Derek, as we've been discussing, of course, the U.S. alliance system was constructed primarily in reaction to high-end military and nuclear threats in the early days of the Cold War. And while there's no question that military challenges from both Russia and China remain possible in these two key regions, it's also very clear that many of the threats we are facing in the 21st century do not occur in the military domain at all. And so that raises a question of whether America's alliances can be useful in this environment. What I argue is they can, and they can be primarily useful by moving into some of these new domains where we are quite likely to continue encountering the bulk of 21st century competition. And this can be done in at least two different ways. In a very discrete set of areas, the United States and its allies might actually consider expanding their Article 5 guarantees to apply to non-military types of attacks. I'm thinking here of things like cyber attacks on critical infrastructure or massive state-backed election interference campaigns, assaults whose effects are so grievous as to jeopardize the political independence of the states who might become victims to them. Again, I think this is worthy of potential inclusion in mutual defense clauses. But on a far broader range of activities than that, alliances can be used as coordination and preparation mechanisms for threats that we can't deter. I'm thinking there certainly of things like investigating the national security implications of China's 5G networks, or responding to the Belt and Road Initiative, or even preparing for the next pandemic. Areas in which there are clearly security implications for allies and where all can solve the problem better if they do so in a coordinated fashion. And the benefit to thinking of our alliances along these broader terms is it actually vastly expands what our allies can do. It creates opportunities for allies in Europe and Asia to potentially work together, let's say through standing working groups on things like cybersecurity or 5G. It allows our allies to potentially specialize according to comparative advantage. Of course, in Europe, Estonia is a complete standout on the cybersecurity front, whereas in Asia, Japan really excels at foreign aid and infrastructure development. And perhaps most importantly, in the context of the debates that we've been having in the United States, this is also a way for allies to contribute more financially without necessarily asking them to do it from their defense budgets. So if we increasingly bring our alliances into non-military domains, allies will be contributing through their foreign ministries and their intelligence communities, and they may be able to do that in a way that's more politically feasible for them than boosting their defense budgets further. So as I see it, broader alliances have the potential to be more balanced and keep these tools trusty and useful for us for, I hope, years to come.
I'm going to be turning shortly to the audience, so I want to encourage folks, if you have a question, to please type one in the Q&A function. We've got a couple already. I've got a bunch more, but I don't want to hog the screen here. Mira, what I'd like to do is really pivot to the current moment. And you make a point. You make the point in the book that President Trump and some of his critiques about America's alliances and whether they're a good deal for the United States or not. It's not just a difference of degree. It's a difference of kind in terms of the critiques he's launched at alliances. So, explain that a little bit. And as part of that, I've always been puzzled by the kind of the politics of alliances in that. Public opinion polls still consistently show wide majority support for U.S. NATO, for example. But yet you still see a temptation in politics to just belittle alliances and allies, and that the U.S. is getting taken for a ride. So first, talk a little bit about how you see the Trump critique, but then also just this paradox of the politics around alliances, but yet what seems to be fairly sustained and durable public support for them.
Absolutely. So on this question of Trump and how he is a difference in kind as opposed to degree, of course, what we're referring to here is the fact that we are mired in burden sharing debates at this moment. But burden sharing and questions about whether allies are doing enough are really as old as the system itself. So the question is, why is it so peaked at this moment? And is this really different than the types of concerns that Trump's predecessors have had? I argue and I believe that it is for a few reasons, but all of which suggest that these obsessions with burden sharing could, in this moment, really come at the expense of the system itself. That is potentially unravel or break our alliances, which will fundamentally leave us so much worse off. There's a couple of reasons that I think we're running this risk. The first is that unlike predecessors who been willing to work with NATO to create a pledge for European allies to increase their defense spending, the president tends to engage in public and arbitrary coercion of allies. So one day they'll be told that they need to reach 2% of GDP spending by next year. Another day they'll be told that they need to reach 4% of spending by a few years from now. So it's impossible for them to know what the objective is, whether or not they can meet it, and therefore whether or not their security is fundamentally at risk. Second, a huge part of the problem, goes on beyond our conversations with the allies, and that is the fact that we've consistently seen the president embrace adversaries and denied shared threats, which is, of course, what the whole alliance system is about. If you don't hold those things in common, then the logic is really being chipped away at its core. So there have been all too many reasons for pause on that front. Additionally, the president, I think, genuinely holds a view of the national security, which is really focused on the American homeland, which is part of the reason why he's not particularly interested in forward defense and doesn't see it as useful to the United States. So if you take all these three things together, it really does look like a set of strategic circumstances that could have the trappings of an American withdrawal, which makes it so different than what we've seen in the past. Nevertheless, Derek, you point to this really important point, which is that we actually still have a lot of bipartisan support for alliances in the United States. And I actually think it has probably risen in recent decades. We could point to much more skepticism, I would say, particularly in the Democratic Party about America's alliances commitments in the 1970s or the 1990s. But now nearly both parties are unified in their support for the United States' use of alliances. The exception to this is those who identify as core-based supporters of the president tend to be a little bit more skeptical of NATO. But I think we should take that as a reflection of partisanship as opposed to, a serious view on the alliance itself. But public opinion seems to show additionally that Americans understand that alliances are a cost-effective way for us to achieve our foreign policy goals. So why would we think of them as being at risk in this moment if public support is so strong? And worth noting that congressional support also remains very strong. I think a big reason for that is the fact that the president has extraordinary powers when it comes to the ability to manage and potentially unravel alliances. That is, once the Senate has given its advice and consent to an American alliance treaty, as it did in the early Cold War period, it has relatively little oversight over how this system is managed and stewarded. So for all the fact that there remains this extraordinary support, there also is the fact that incredible volatility has been introduced into the system with clear evidence that there are relatively few brakes on the president's ability to upend this achievement of American statecraft if he should choose to do so.
And one of the things that you do very effectively, I think, in this book is you push back against this notion that alliances are a bad deal for the United States. And one of the ways you do it is you take head on the arguments that alliances are costly, that they either entrap the United States or they put us in danger of abandonment by our partners who don't stand up with us. So talk a little bit about how you offer really great detail in this book on these arguments, but give us a summary of that.
Sure. Yeah, so I basically argue that alliance costs have been much lower than any of our alliance critics allege in a number of ways. They've been financially a pretty good deal for the United States, and politically, they've neither entangled nor abandoned us the way that critics suggest that they will. Financially, the United States has historically spent a little bit more on defense than its allies, but for a long time, it was because it wanted it this way. In the early days of the Cold War, the United States actually preferred to spend more than its allies on defense, all the better to influence their national security policies. And of course, it's worth noting that alliances themselves are not upfront costly, but rather it's the associated forward deployment of troops and bases. And wherever the United States has done this, it's because it deemed it to be in its national security interest. Nevertheless, we can ask ourselves whether we should be renegotiating these arrangements now or whether allies might be able to contribute a bit more. But the key thing that I find is that these comparisons between US spending and allied spending are often really uninformative. The real way we should be thinking about financial costs is in terms of the cost of our preferred American foreign policy. An American foreign policy that is able to rely on alliances is almost certainly far cheaper than a similar policy that can't do the same. So when you look at the comparison that way, then these questions over relatively small differences in allied spending are less significant. When it comes to the questions of entrapment and abandonment, this is another area where I really find the sort of critical views come up wanting. The United States has never been entrapped in a war on an ally's behalf. In fact, no American ally has ever been the victim of an unprovoked attack. So that hasn't been possible. And while the United States has entered crises on its allies' behalf, it's generally done so because it saw its own national interest there as well. So that was not a sort of entanglement mechanism happening. And the general reason for this is smart alliance design. In the partners it's chosen to ally with, in the writing of its treaties, and in its decision to sometimes end alliances, the United States has actually minimized a lot of risk to itself. Finally, on the question of abandonment, that is the idea that allies would just jilt us on the brink of conflict or somehow not be there for us when we need them the most. This is another place where the record is incredibly good for America's alliances. The United States is, of course, the only country on whose behalf an Article 5 commitment has ever been invoked. And that was after the September 11th attacks when allies clamored to our aid. And beyond that one instance of this mutual security system being invoked, the United States has actually enjoyed incredible support on foreign battlefields from allies when it has chosen to fight wars of choice, everywhere from Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan. So far from being disappointed by its allies in its hour of need, the United States has enjoyed far more support than it ever should have expected in moments of conflict as a result of the system.
Well, it leads to one of the questions we've gotten from the audience, which is kind of the reverse angle of that, which is that the part of the success of America's alliances from America's perspective is that they're largely an outgrowth of US interests, core interests, and that our allies often perceive themselves as being the second fiddle. And that there are significant complaints from the UK and Germany and France that they're not a full partner in the alliance. So question is, I mean, how do you see those arguments, and if we have an expectation that alliances are going to have to be reinvented to last into the future, how might that have to change?
Yeah, it's an important question, and I think worth noting one that again has sort of plagued the system since its early history. In some ways, these concerns were built in at the outset precisely because America's alliances were so asymmetric in their earliest years. That is, primarily the United States was the only one who possessed nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them, although of course there were some small exceptions there. So that built into the alliance system a huge asymmetry of information, which is a really significant thing to account for. And I think something that continues to vex alliances to this day. And it's a challenge that we're always dealing with. That is, if one power in the alliance is the one who you're depending on for the ultimate security guarantee in your prospective moment of need, they can never completely assure you that they're going to be there for you when push comes to shove. The United States can never fully promise its allies that if it had to use a nuclear weapon on behalf of South Korea against North Korea, that it would definitely do that exactly as Seoul would prefer. So what it really has to do is direct a lot of US foreign policy efforts to demonstrating the political commitment that suggests that it will. And these types of concerns that you're citing, that is the concerns that an ally is not a full partner, that maybe the United States is not taking their interest to heart, are as a result constant and perennial in alliances. My hope in sort of setting out this agenda and suggesting that we could broaden our alliance system for non-military domains is that this actually helps to build in some resilience on exactly these types of issues. That is, if we see allies increasingly taking the lead and cooperating with each other and modestly less directly reliant on the United States for forms of important defense cooperation, then these asymmetries and concerns about information are a little bit less. That is, if allies in Asia are not just working with each other, but are also increasingly able to at least share information with European partners about 5G risks or cybersecurity concerns, then the likelihood that the United States becomes erratic or takes a policy position that directly jeopardizes one of them is actually less. So again, I think by broadening these alliances, increasingly trying to network them such as that is possible, we start to mitigate some of these asymmetries that have been with us for a very long time.
Well, on the theme of networking alliances, questions come in from Hans Benendijk, who's one of the deepest thinkers about the NATO alliance. And he makes the point that Secretary General Stoltenberg has recently suggested the need for a closer relationship between NATO and Asian democracies. And he's curious how you would approach that and how far you think we can go or should go. And should there be a military dimension, for example, European contributions to U.S. Freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea?
It's a great question. And I wish that we could ask him to chime in as well, because I'd love to hear his views on it. My general perspective is that I do think there's a lot of opportunity here, but that we have to be modest in our goals for this form of cooperation. That is because, of course, both alliance systems have a lot on their plates. And I think if we become overly optimistic about what NATO is going to be able to do, and in particular contribute militarily to Asia, we may be disappointed. That said, I think there are a few key areas where more cooperation is possible and desirable, and I think very feasible. And I've already pointed to a couple of those. The first is an area where I think it would have been nice to have seen more European Asian alliance cooperation the whole way along, or at least for the last few years. And that is in evaluating the implications of China's 5G networks, and more broadly, building out trans-regional working groups on the national security implications of new technologies. This has been an area where I think US foreign policy has not been particularly helpful. The United States took a position that essentially all of its allies had to choose to work with Huawei or stand aside and protect their relationships and their intelligence relationships with the United States. But of course, the United States was not offering a 5G alternative or even a pathway for how to get one. So it put a lot of allies in very difficult positions. I tend to think that this process would have been a little smoother if our European partners had had the opportunity to engage deeply with some of the intelligence that Japan and Australia were already working with when they came to their own decisions on similar questions. And going forward, Britain has actually already suggested to us a way in which this might be further possible. That is the idea that a consortium of allies in Europe and Asia could actually pool resources and investment to invest in a 5G alternative themselves and build the technology cooperatively. To my mind, this is sort of a case in point of a really fruitful nexus of European and Asian alliance interests. Another area where I see some convergence, where I would be somewhat hopeful about the possibility of cooperation, is on responses to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, this is an initiative that started out primarily in Asia, but very quickly has become global. And of course, China has made significant investments now inside of Europe, including in some key and longstanding NATO allied countries, such as Italy. Even more so now in this crisis moment that we're all living through, we're seeing some of the perils and pitfalls of China's development model blown wide open, as a lot of recipients of Belt and Road loans are now facing massive debt crises themselves. So countries like Japan and Australia, I think, have been especially thoughtful in figuring out how to navigate China's infrastructure building and offer quiet alternatives without necessarily roiling Beijing too much. It seems to me that this is an approach that European partners increasingly have a stake in. So I also think that there is some opportunity for, again, a standing set of working groups or channels on alternative infrastructure investment and evaluation that could make for very fruitful cross-regional cooperation.
That's a great idea. Mira, another question that's come in from Conrad Tribble, who's a diplomat in residence at GMF actually right now. He asks, about the economic dimension of alliance building and alliance maintenance. And does it matter, either historically or practically, whether allies in the security realm are also economic partners or competitors? So, for example, is it relevant to the future possibilities for a NATO if what happens on trade and commerce between the US and the EU goes south? Just how do you see those relationships developing, the security and the economic?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think history would indicate that it certainly matters, but that these relationships are not sort of dispositive of one another. That is, that one can move in one direction without necessarily completely imperiling the other. A key example that I would point to is the state of the US-Japan alliance as the Cold War ended. In that moment, China actually was really not on the horizon as a great power competitor in Asia. In fact, it looked like Japan could be the new resident great power in Asia. And this was primarily because of its growing economic power and ensuing trade issues between Japan and the United States. Between sort of the late 1980s and the mid 90s, trade issues really consumed Washington and Tokyo. So much so that folks in the Pentagon who had roles like the one that Derek used to occupy were sort of accused of enabling the Japanese by dint of the fact that they were trying to keep the security alliance on track. And for a bunch of years, it seemed like it really might be in jeopardy. That is, that Tokyo's protectionist policies might be enough to sink the American security commitment. But ultimately, negotiations sort of improved between the United States and Japan, and the regional security case for keeping that alliance alive became ever more clear over the course of the ensuing years. So the two streams sort of came back together. That's all to say there's no question that poor economic relations can put a lot of downward pressure on a security relationship, but it doesn't necessarily break it. And I think if alliance managers are committed to keeping it on track and to integrating those two streams of policy, we're all much better off.
Mm-hmm. Mira, I'd like to give you a chance to talk a little bit about two of the alliance relationships that in recent years have been the most strained, I would argue, and that's South Korea and Germany. Both what you see is going on, kind of what's behind the current differences, and I mean, it's kind of, I know what your answer is going to be in terms of whether it's positive or negative, but just perhaps walk us through what you think the negative ramifications could be.
Absolutely. So, we've talked a bit already, Derek, about burden sharing and my concerns that the problem with this sort of last few years of burden sharing standoffs is that they're really at risk of breaking our alliances. And the fact that this will be incredibly costly to the United States if they do. And that's what I see at play in both Germany and in South Korea. I'll take the Germany case first because, of course, it's been the most in the headlines. It appears to have come up relatively recently, perhaps precipitated by Chancellor Merkel's decision not to come to the United States for the G7. And the details are really still up in the air. The decision blindsided both our German allies as well as the US Pentagon. But the idea is, of course, that the United States is going to withdraw about 10,000 troops from Germany. From both a security and from a spending perspective, however, this seems to me like a pretty self-defeating move. From a security perspective, Germany, of course, is not an ally simply as a philanthropic effort. Rather, US forces are in Germany for a much broader set of missions that are really about the way that the United States defines its own security. Germany is headquarters to our European command as well as our Africa command. It's the host of major military hospitals and training facilities. So a major drawdown from Germany should really leave us asking the question of what has changed in the United States security environment to warrant that change. And I don't think we've seen that case forthcoming. Rather, it seems that this is about cost issues with the hope of inducing Germany to spend more, which I think is highly unlikely. Germany, of course, is a bit behind the mark in meeting its Wales targets of 2% of GDP by 2024, but Angela Merkel is wildly popular at home, does not have a lot of time left in office, and doesn't have the ability to deficit spend to raise Germany's defense spending. So she's very unlikely to up German spending. Quite to the contrary, the costs are actually likely to be borne by the United States, because the 10,000 troops that leave Germany will have to go somewhere. And when they get to where they're going, they'll probably need new facilities built for them. We'll have to close the old facilities and pay for those. And of course, these service members will remain in the force, so many of their carrying costs will remain the same. This is all to say that this looks like an endeavor that can really strike at the heart of NATO unity, has already been hailed as a welcome development by the Russian Foreign Ministry, and is likely to be borne the cost by the US taxpayer. Similarly, over in South Korea, we have had an explicit share of a set of burden sharing standoffs for the last several months, when the administration has asked our South Korean allies to quintuple their spending under the threat of a troop reduction, which has been made several times to Seoul in the last few years. Now, the case of South Korea really sort of boggles the mind and defies any logic of international relations, because while this spending standoff has been going on, North Korea has acquired an ICBM and continues to build nuclear weapons. So every law of geopolitics should tell us that this alliance is pulling closer together, when in fact it's really fraying. Which raises the question of why ask the South Koreans to quintuple their spending when they were already one of the cheapest places on earth to base American troops. One answer may be that the administration is driving a hard bargain to try to get Seoul to up its spending whatever level it reaches, although it has not been willing to accept a number of pretty good offers thus far. Another explanation could be a demonstration effect, that is, an effort to not only scare Seoul, but encourage the Japanese to spend more, as well as the Germans. A third would be that this is actually a pretext, that there is a desire to draw down from the Korean Peninsula despite the growing shared security threat. And I think that it goes without saying that a moment where we very clearly need alliance defense and deterrence of North Korea more than ever, breaking the US-South Korea alliance over a spending issue is the ultimate form of self-defeat for US strategy and national security.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's pretty clear that based on all the reporting we've seen from multiple sources that President Trump believes that we should not be in South Korea. So
exactly, which is why we have to worry about this as pretext, in which case, why the negotiations at all, right?
Yeah. Same story in Germany.
Exactly. And this sort of circles us back to the point that we discussed earlier, Derek, which is the extraordinary alliance powers bestowed to the president. Mm-hmm. That is the ability to increase or reduce troop levels vested in the executive branch, the relatively little by way of roadblocks that Congress can possibly put up. Mm-hmm. So I think certainly when it comes to envisioning the possibilities of a second term of Trump, this is centrally going to be what our allies are worried about.
Mm-hmm. Just got time for a few more questions, and one of them comes in from Ian Wallace, who asks about the question of interoperability, and that alliance collaboration and success obviously depends on interoperability, and how confident you are that US allies are going to be able to keep up with emerging technologies, AI, quantum, et cetera, over time. And what does the US do if they can't? And also in the spirit of keeping our alliances robust, how should we help them keep up if needed?
Yeah, that's a great question, and another one where I would love to draw him into the conversation, as well as to hear some of your ideas on this issue, Derek. I think there is no question that the United States is likely to have a bit of a gap between itself and its allies when it comes to the leading edge in some forms of technological innovation, and that the United States and China are likely to be the peer competitors in that space. But I would note that I think importantly, US allies in both Europe and Asia remain highly capable middle powers and technological adopters, including on issues of new technology. That is to say that even if the United States has the leading edge in innovation, they are able to close the adoption gap very quickly, which bodes relatively well for the ability to continue cooperation on new technologies and to remain interoperable together. This is another reason, however, per your question, that I'm bullish about the idea of allies in Europe and Asia increasingly working together, because some amount of adoption and understanding the sort of tips and tricks for how to bring new technologies on board, if you're not the United States, are usefully shared amongst allies in Europe and Asia with different comparative advantages in different forms of new technology. I would, Derek, be very interested for your views on this question as well, though. It's certainly a critically important one.
Well, I have too many. I have two questions I want to get to, but I mean, I think the short. No, I think the short of it. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think that there's, there's. First of all, it's only been recent that we've even been in a position to have a common conversation with our European partners, for example, on some of these emerging technologies, and I think we need to get ourselves positioned so when we do have these breakthroughs, and hopefully it's going to be the United States that has them first, they're able to catch up very quickly. But what I wanted to get to, because we're almost running out of time, is, my experience, at least in writing books, is that they're kind of a journey where you get surprised along the way, right? You obviously have your idea and you know what you want to argue, and your book is a really nice, tight argument. But what surprised you the most in the writing of the book as you did the research and you thought more deeply about it? Was there something that you found yourself realizing you didn't appreciate something as much as you should have, or you thought something was more important going in than it was going out?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I think it is the idea that we sort of tossed around earlier, and that is the fact that alliances have always been an incredibly difficult and messy endeavor. As someone who's trained in political science, but also a student of history, I think I sort of had this glossy vision of there having been a golden age, particularly in NATO. Everything worked really smoothly and we were all on the same page and we knew what we were after and we were rising to the Cold War challenge together. And the reality is that there have been crises and moments of utter dismay and seeming collapse for as long as this has been a tool of statecraft. And part of the reason why it is so remarkable is because alliance managers on both sides of the Atlantic and the Pacific have made it their business to keep rebuilding and reinventing these things even when they do hit stumbling blocks. So to me, what looked like this sort of glossy glow that faded pretty quickly actually became more of a reason for optimism. That is to say that in this moment where it feels like American alliances are really in peril, where there is a lot to worry about, both in the transatlantic relationship and in Asia, we could also be at a moment where we are at a reckoning, but begin to rebuild. And that would be consistent with the story throughout the life of this tool, and bode very well for the future indeed.
That's a great point. And then finally, you've alluded to leaders. You've said, alliances, it's because of leaders on both sides of the Atlantic or both sides of the Pacific that our alliances have been as successful as they've been. Are there particular leaders on either side of the Atlantic or Pacific that you think of, and as you were writing this book and researching it, that stood out to you as the folks who really got it, who were really not just indispensable in their moment, but had a particular insight into the importance of alliances or how they operate that you would want us to take away to try to emulate in the future?
Gosh, yeah, that is a great question. There were a number in the early Cold War project, to be sure. Dean Acheson was one of them. John Foster Dulles was also one of them. Was really a critical architect of the entire U.S. alliance system in Asia, although he got a little bit ahead of himself at times. But I would also point to the sort of broad cohort of NATO leaders in the 1960s who recognized that the alliance was really in a crisis moment with the advent of Soviet nuclear parity. And especially after Charles de Gaulle exited the alliance, the effort by a number of leaders on both sides of the Atlantic to really do a deep dive study into what would be necessary to hold them all together into the next era. There was a study called the Harmel Report, done by a gentleman named Pierre Harmel, which was kind of the culmination of those efforts. So I think these examples of leaders who not only were able to, like John Foster Dulles, understand what alliances could and could not do well and bake those into decisions about where to form alliances and not, but also recognize trouble when they saw it and pull together in those moments to try to make the best and to forge their way out of it. That's what really stands out to me as what I hope we will find in our own leaders in this era.
Well, that's a great point to end on, Mira. I want to thank you again for writing this book. I want to thank you for taking the last hour to be with us and have this great conversation. It could have gone on much longer. Before we go, we need to give a shout out for your next book, because you've got one coming out soon with the Rebecca listener. So tell us a little bit about that.
My co-author and Rebecca Listener and I have a book coming out in September. It's called An Open World: How America Can Win the Contest for 21st Century International Order. And it's really a look at what America's role in the world should be after this moment. That is, in a post-Trump world, what our grand strategy should be and how we get from here to there.
So we will heartily welcome you back to GMF. Can't be sure we can do it in person when the book comes out, but either in person or virtually, we'd love to have you and Rebecca back to talk about that book. In the meantime, I want everyone to rush online and buy this book. Go to your independent bookseller or bookshop.org and buy Shields of the Republic by Mira Rapp-Hooper. Mira, thank you again for taking the time to be with us today. And congratulations again on this great book.
Derek, thank you for a wonderful conversation. It was a real treat. And thanks to you all for joining us. Please stay well.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being with us and stay safe. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.